Wow, that is amazing, Rose shouted. How did we even do that? I mean, making a few vines is one thing, but how could we create a tree like that? I mean, it's huge. Rose, we of the Sky Ray are givers of life. We are blessed with bountiful life essence, overflowing, Rose. The energy that all things take in order to sustain their lives. We of the Sky Ray produce in such quantities that it boggles the mind, and thus we are able to grant life to all things around us. Just as I told you before, we could bring life to even the most barren of wastelands, and in quick order. So long as the seeds of life exist, we can create life anywhere. And even if they don't exist, we can simply bring them with us and create them of our own accord and will. What do you mean create them? Rose said, looking at her mother for a moment, feeling a bit confused. Well, perhaps a demonstration. Her mother kneeled down to the ground for a moment, placing her hand on a small patch of grass. And after only a few seconds, a small plant began to bloom there as she raised her hand. It looked like some sort of a flower. However, it wasn't one that looked familiar to Rose. As it continued to grow, blooming out, spreading and having petals, there at the center of the flower, Rose could see what looked like some sort of a large seed. Her mother gently grasped the seed and plucked it from the flower. And there we have it, she said as she stood back to her feet. No doubt at this point you note that the flower and the seed that it produced is not something that you are used to seeing. They look unusual, yes? That is because we of the Sky Ray are creators of life. Through the energy we produce, we can create any number of living things based on our will. The seeds from which they start are only really the beginning blueprint. We can let them bloom as they naturally would if we desire. This is in fact the easiest way to go about it. But so long as we have the energy, which I assure you we have in abundance, we can actually influence the growth and development of any living plant that we produce. Tell it to grow as we wish it to grow, and in this way, produce whatever is necessary, not simply whatever happens to be there. We could turn blades of grass into flowers, flowers into trees, ones that already exist, or ones that we create ourselves for our own purposes. The options are basically infinite, so long as our imagination is as wide. From any living seed that is capable of blossoming and spreading forth life, we can create an infinite number of possibilities, creating plants to suit whatever need we have, whether it be sustenance or other things. We can imbue our will and desire within those seeds, and by providing an extra amount of energy, create what we want, regardless of what the seed originally was intended to be. This is why we are creators of life, Rose. But perhaps a more impressive demonstration. At this point, we've created a nice shady place underneath this tree, haven't we? She said, looking up to the tree branches above head. But it still doesn't feel quite homey enough. So, how about we create a house? What do you mean a house, Mom? You can't make a house from a plant. I don't care how much you want it, that just doesn't make sense. Her mother smiled and chuckled a bit. Well, maybe not in the sense that a regular human being would consider a house. No, I'm going to show you how to produce a sky ray house, the same type that all of our people lived in, her mother said as she sat the seed gently on the ground, walking over to Rose and grabbing her by the hand gently again. Now, come, Rose, we'll need to give it some space, she said as she led Rose back, a fair distance away from the seed. Now, this works just like before. All we do is focus and imbue our will within nature. And by doing this, we can create life befitting our desire. But understand, Rose, that creating something that is far different from what originally was intended is a much heavier task than creating something and simply forcing it to accelerate its growth. The more you change it, the more energy it requires. But once again, we of the Sky Ray have abundant life force, and even changing things is a fairly simple task for us. So, watch closely, her mother said as she kneeled to the ground once more, placing her palms on the grass and beginning to focus. Rose looked out at the seed in the distance, barely able to see it through the grass. But she did see that suddenly it was as if the grass and earth itself swallowed the seed up, dragging it down into the dirt below. And in the place where the seed planted itself, a large bud began to grow, roots beginning to spread out, large leaves that wrapped around it. From all appearances, it seemed to be a flower bud, a very large flower bud that simply continued to get bigger and bigger and bigger with every passing second. The roots grasping out, extending more and more, springing to life and whirling across the ground, digging into the earth and dirt as the bud simply continued to grow. Before long, it was the size of a cow, and then the size of a car, and it only continued to get bigger. Before long, the flower bud was absolutely massive. She could see the petals, a bright yellow color, with the green leaves still wrapped around them very firmly, as the base of the bud continued to widen itself, getting larger and larger, until finally it stopped growing, at which point the petals began to unfurl themselves, spreading out, opening up as if a flower trying to invite sunlight. It was absolutely beautiful, Rose thought to herself. I've never seen something so beautiful. And as the petals unfurled, opening wide, there was a burst, a flurry of yellow dust that drifted out into the wind. As the petals spread wide, opening to show a base, there at the center of the flower bud was what looked like yellow fur, a puffy substance that lined the entire bottom section of the center of this massive flower. And the petals themselves simply laid themselves out upon the ground in all directions, as if they were allowing themselves to be a walkway towards the center. Rose's mother stood up, as Rose was still staring at the flower in amazement. Okay, it looks like it's all done. It's been a while since I've made one of these. It's so comforting to see, her mother said. In fact, I would actually like to stay here tonight, rather than that cramped house. It would make me feel so much better. Stay here? Rose said. You mean like on the flower? Yes, Rose, her mother said, giggling a bit. It is a house after all. Mom, it's a flower. It's not a house. One and the other are different. No, I think you're still learning, her mother said, grasping her hand again and beginning to lead her towards the flower. As Rose stepped on the petals, she noted that they were very soft. They had a very warm feeling as her feet came in contact with them, a mix between soft and squishy, and yet they were firm enough to hold her and didn't seem to be damaged by her stepping on them. And Rose was even more amazed once her feet came in contact with that somewhat furry-looking center. It felt so soft, warm, and inviting. As they stepped towards the center, Rose kneeled down, beginning to feel, reaching out with her hands and rubbing them against the somewhat furry-looking center of the flower. The entire thing was just so warm. The strands of fur-like material felt so inviting. Rose, in fact, felt that she could easily sleep on a material like this. It was like sleeping on a bed with silk sheets, furry silk sheets. Rose, in fact, couldn't help herself and simply lied down on it, spreading her arms and legs out and rolling over to stare at the skyline, the tree above her head that her and her mother grew together, small bits of sunlight peeking through and shining down on her, a slight breeze wafting by. It felt so comfortable, almost natural.